Hey, this is Tucker with your third ecology vocabulary list. Please take note of the word, part of speech, definition, and any example that I give you or that you think of that will help you to remember these words. And if at any point I am going too fast, please pause the recording. The very first word is fauna, and this word should sound familiar because we covered it when we were talking about the text, The Omnivore's Dilemma. But fauna is a noun, and it is all of the animal life in an area. And so often you will hear the term fauna used with flora, and the fauna is the animal life in the area, whereas the flora is the plant life in an area. So flora, think flowers, plant life in an area. Food web is a noun, and many food chains that are put together are considered a food web. And that web shows how all of the energy flows through an ecosystem. And remember, in our first ecology vocabulary list, we talked about ecosystem, right? The way in which the parts work together. And so when you talk about a food web, there are multiple food chains because within an ecosystem, there are lots of different food chains at work, and when you put them together, you create almost this interconnected web that shows the relationships between the different animals and what they eat and what they are consumed by within an ecosystem. So a food web is a little bit more complicated than a food chain. And food chain is a noun, and it is the order in which animals feed on plants and other animals, and shows how the energy flows from producer to consumer to decomposer. Again, all words that we've covered in our previous ecology list. So when you see a food chain tends to be more linear, providing a very discrete, very explicit order in which animals at the bottom of the food chain kind of work, how it works its way up, where animals consume, other producers and consumers, and then, how the decomposers are at work. So it's that whole order of how animals feed on plants and other animals. Again, this tends to be a little simpler. However, when you pull together multiple food chains from an ecosystem and create that food web, it becomes a little bit more complicated. Population is a noun, and population is just all of the members of one species that live in an area. And so we might talk about the population of sea otters in a particular location, right? Or you might see, population charts that show the number of people or the number of one kind of species that live all across the globe, right? So just population is that all of the members of one species living in one area. Predator is a noun, and a predator is an animal that hunts, kills, and eats other animals. So predator hunts, kills, and eats other animals. A really good example of predators are like our big cats, right? You get your lions, you get your tigers. They hunt, they kill, they feed on other animals. Prey is a noun, and that is unfortunately the animal that is hunted, killed, and eaten by a predator. So typically that we'll think of kind of maybe more defenseless animals when we think about prey. They're a little more vulnerable in terms of the food chain. And so a lot of times you'll think of like small animals like rabbits or mice, right? They're often prey for larger animals, owls, big cats, things that can hunt them down, kill them, and then survive on eating them. Producer is a noun, and a producer is an organism that can create its own food. And so when we think about producers, you should definitely be thinking about plants, right, that use photosynthesis to turn sunshine into the nutrients that they need to survive. So within the plant, they produce all of the necessary nutrients that they need. So great example of a producer. And then primary consumers are nouns. Those are animals that eat primary producers. They're also known as plant eaters or herbivores, which was in one of our earlier lists. So when you see primary consumers, think plant eaters, or herbivores, animals that eat primary producers. So even a really big animal like a giraffe is really subsisting on trees or leaves from a tree, which would make it a primary consumer, right? It's an herbivore. It lives and subsists on plant life. It is a plant eater. Secondary consumers, that's also a noun, are animals that eat primary consumers. So they can be carnivores or they can be omnivores, right? We talked about carnivores, carne, eating meat, omnivores, all something or an organism that eats meat, or carnivores and producers and consumers, right? So they can eat plant life and meat. So when we think about a secondary consumer, we might not think of something like a duck, but a duck actually can eat both the plants and things growing inside their environment, but also insects and other like small fish and things in the water as well. So they're feeding both on plant life and on animals. Tertiary consumers are carnivores that are at the top of the food chain that feed on other carnivores. So typically it's an animal that feeds on secondary consumers, and usually they're not threatened by other carnivores, right? Because they are kind of at the top of that food chain. So when we think about tertiary consumers, and the word tertiary means third in order or third in line. Tertiary consumers, think about the third kind of level of the food chain. They're at the top of that food chain, at the top level. And so an example might be a great white shark as a tertiary consumer.